Okay, does it see, they just showing that your screen that it's recording?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, sorry about the little delay. All right, well, good morning to everyone,
Morning.
to all
Morning.
of you.
Morning.
And after this week, we'll meet next week, and that'll be the final class until our summer, for our summer break. We will begin again on the Tuesday right after Labor Day. Not the week of Labor Day, but the following week. I think it's something like September 9th or so is when we'll begin. And then I did look up at the holidays, and yes, next year some of the holidays will fall on Tuesdays. It's the pattern when Rosh Hashanah falls on Tuesdays. Then you have, I believe it's the beginning of Sukkot and then Shmini Atzeret. So there will be 3 dates in September or October where we won't be meeting, but let's not worry about that now. Again, important thing is we're meeting next week and taking the break until the week after Labor Day. Okay. Okay. And I think people had asked me about changing the time, but we're going to stick with this time.
Yes.
It works best for me. I did
Right.
go to the seminar last week with the Rabbinical Assembly, and that was certainly worthwhile. But uh, if it happens once or twice over the course of the year, I don't think it's necessary to make a general time change. Okay. All right. So let's
Okay, Rabbi, I'm just going to apologize in advance. This is Remy. I turned off my video temporarily. I have to leave a few minutes early. I have a meeting at our synagogue.
okay. Have a
okay.
wonderful meeting.
Oh, thank you. It's a wonderful synagogue.
Good. I can't say that I miss going to all the meetings I used to go to for the synagogue. I go to other meetings instead for other committees and groups that I'm a part of, some of which for some other time. Anyway, last week we were talking about the subject of counting the Sefer Torah. Or actually, what is interesting is the way that Rabbi David Fine has framed it. He says, may a meaning be constituted by 9 plus a sacred object like a Torah scroll. And we saw that in the Talmudic text, there was some indication that 9 plus an ark, an aron, could make a minion. And then there was objections to it. One objection was, what are you talking about? This is not a person. And in order to make the statement make sense, in classic Talmudic fashion, when you have a statement that doesn't seem to be true or make sense, you try to sort of figure out how it could make sense. And they say, well, we're talking about a situation where you have a bunch of people and you can't quite be sure if it's 10 or not. So you say there's 9 and you count the Torah as the 10th. Neither of those positions make it clear at all that you can count the 10th. Now, there was a position that talked about in a Mizuman in the 3 that are required for the Birkat Hamazon to use an introduction that mentions God's name, right? Right? You only say that with at least 3 adults. And there was a position, but this is later on, which again is not at all clear, that you could count as a third, one person, for those 3, a minor. There's this discussion is by talking about just a kid who can read Torah or a kid who knows about God, and there was some discussion about that. But the bottom line, as we have seen, is the appropriateness of the leniency of counting a minor with a Torah in a Sha'at Dachak. That was an important distinction. These are times of an emergency situation. Is it appropriate? And what is an emergency, right? If you want to, even in those situations where you might count as a 10th. Remember, the Torah in the ark does not count. So in none of the further discussions of this do we talk about counting the Torah, but you might have a question where, when a child, for the 10th, a sophisticated human child, not a sacred object. It is, and while it is mentioned for the Birkat Hamazon, it is rejected by many of the major decisors. As a matter of fact, it said that most rabbis say, no, you can't do that. So we got into this discussion, and this question was also raised about a Zoom minyan. Is a Zoom minyan an emergency situation? Can you count people who are on Zoom and not physically present for the minyan? That was discussed, and you might notice there were several decisions about. There were more than one decision about doing it. Where were they? Okay, here. One of the three conclusions: if a community already uses loopholes to count the Torah as the 10th, then the virtual participant can be counted as the 10th only, i.e., you can't have 5 real people and 5 people on Zoom. You got to have 9 and 1. All right, that's one opinion. But Rabbi Fine says, well, we're doing this because of it's a sha'ad dechak, a pressing emergency situation. That term usually applies to a temporary emergency.
Right.
And as we know, the Zoom minyan did not end with the end of the pandemic. In point of fact, our own synagogue has people on Zoom. Synagogues all over the country have people on Zoom for the minyanim. So those who would approve or those who would disapprove. And here's where we got up to last week. Okay, well, this paragraph, he dedicates it to the memory of his father, Rabbi Fine. Again, we're talking about Rabbi Fine in Ridgewood. His father passed away recently. He opposed it. The custom might make sense in the shtetl in the old country, where there were 9 Jewish men over bar mitzvah, and the closest living village was a journey away. That could happen in a small shtetl. I was in the research I'm doing about Patzov. Patzov, I had a synagogue. It had at some point well over 200 Jews, but you read about the places where some of the people were born, and I'm listing where they were born, and you can see that there were tiny towns whose total population was 200 individuals, and there were 2 Jewish families living there, or 3, very few. Yes, it's the old classic Jewish store, right? Where you had, and by the way, that was true in the United States, particularly in the southern parts of the United States, where you had small numbers of Jews who, because of the restrictions that were imposed upon them, were in limited occupational niches, and you'd have towns with small numbers of Jews, right? So the question he's saying is, well, all right, Rabbi Fine's father, Zikron Olav, is saying, okay, in a shtetl, you had 9 adults, and you couldn't, that was it, 9 male Jewish adults. So what are you going to do? So he said, okay, maybe. In one of my last halakhic discussions with him the week before he died, I just agreed to write this paper. He added that the leniency might apply if one were on the wagon train in the Old West. I used to watch that show, Wagon Train.
Yeah.
Did they ever? I don't think they had any ones where the basic problem of the episode was, are we going to have a minyan or not? Although Northern Exposure did. Remember that show, Northern Exposure, about Jews in Alaska? There was one show that was pretty much dedicated to finding whether or not they could make a minyan in a small town in Alaska. Okay, but not on Wagon Train. Okay, so maybe if you were in Alaska, in a small town, right? But it should not apply in our community, where it is not that we do not have enough Jews, as that the Jews choose not to come to the synagogue. Does that sound familiar?
Right.
Hey, while I was the rabbi of the Fair Lawn Jewish Center, more than one night I got on the phone, or somebody got on the phone, and we called. Remember Joe Friedman?
Yes.
He lived right next door to the synagogue, so he got a lot of phone calls, as did Barry Schwartz, who lived around the corner. And yes, the Alpers. How many times were you guys called, Sima?
And then when our kids became bar mitzvahs, we could bring them with us.
Right, and that was not uncommon. And again, it's not because there's only 9 Jews living in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, but clearly there just weren't enough who wanted to come to the minyan. Of course, then with the pandemic, everything went on Zoom. And today, my understanding, not as familiar as I was then, is that there is an in-person minyan at the synagogue in the evening and on Sunday morning, and it is also on Zoom. They count people on Zoom to make the minyan. Is that correct, Charlie?
Well,
On Sunday, we do, yes. I mean,
they do, but there are a lot of
not to
people.
say not to say Kaddish. We need 10.
In other words, to say Kaddish, I remember being asked about my opinion on this, to which case I deferred. I said, sorry, not the rabbi of the synagogue anymore. You need to, I'm not the one who's making this decision. So Charlie, let me, so if there are 9 people in the room and a 10th to make the minyan, but then you do not say Kaddish?
Well, we
need
do.
10
We
in the
do.
room to say Kaddish.
We do.
Fran,
but
is that correct?
There are some people, some of the people who are saying Kaddish don't approve of that, and they also go across the street later to say it again when they have a
Okay.
minyan.
Rabbi, 90% of the time, 95% of the time, we are getting a minyan in person. I think this last Sunday was like 5 and 5, but last night and almost every night we do get the minyan.
Okay, that's good to hear. But
Sunday,
we had 5,
we
and
did
when you
have
had
10
5
at
and
the end.
5, you said there was a minyan, so you said you said Kaddish?
Yes, they did.
Okay, so that's where things stand now at the synagogue. Again, a new rabbi will be there at some point whose opinion will be sought to say that. But again, notice what Rabbi Fine says. He says Jewish non-observance should not constitute the sha'at dechak. In other words, what's an emergency? The emergency is that a lot of Jews don't feel like going to the synagogue, right? Is that an emergency? Is that an emergency? Well, Rabbi Fine is saying clearly no. Okay. The effect of the employment of this leniency, my father taught, would be essentially to reduce the requirement of a minyan from 10 to 9. Ultimately, by permitting leniency that was originally only a sha'ad dechak to general practice, we will in essence be lessening the standards of forming a minyan and relieving our community of the incentive to gather for public prayer. Do you agree with that statement?
No.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, in our shul, we do have Wednesday and Sunday morning minyanim in person and on Zoom. But starting July 4th weekend for the summer, it'll be only on Zoom. So I guess they assume a lot of people are away, and even if they're somewhere else, they can Zoom in and say Kaddish. So that's, that's
okay,
what
but
happens.
understand, even with some people away, I could be wrong, but my guess is that there are more than 9 adult Jews physically in Princeton.
Absolutely.
Throughout.
Right.
I actually have hired a guard for Sunday morning just for the minyan.
Okay, so this question of sha'ad dechak of an emergency is, well, people go to the shore, So Rabbi Fine, you by this would not be happy about that, because again, on that sentence, by permitting the leniency that was intended only as sha'ad dechak to a general practice, we will be lessening the standards of forming a minyan.
Right.
The endorsement of this leniency would likely be employed by congregations that are too small to maintain a minyan because they have too few Jews, but rather have too few Jews who will commit to the synagogue to maintain a minyan, essentially reducing the definition of minyan from 10 to 9. That's
Now, I
what
don't
his
really
fear is.
know what the reasons are. It could be that it's nothing else is going on Sunday morning, so it's too expensive to run the air conditioning or open the synagogue or hire a guard. I have no idea what the reasoning is, but I do know that in the summer, our shul accepts a Zoom minyan. That was the point. Our
Okay.
shul accepts a total Zoom minyan.
But would they accept 9 present and 1 on Zoom?
Yes, of course, because if they accept
Okay.
10 on Zoom, I'm sure they would, they accept 9 on Zoom.
Okay,
Or maybe more because it's a hybrid minion. So, you know, if it's snowing and they get a few people who actually live in Princeton, and many of us do not live close to the synagogue, so we wouldn't be able to get there, let's say in a snowstorm, so then they have it on Zoom and
okay.
in person.
When do you
But as
stop?
you know, it depends on the rabbi.
Well,
Mm.
also here, what's depending on? It depends on what do you consider an emergency situation. And by expanding the definition of emergency situation, Rabbi Wise is concerned that that will reduce the importance of people physically
Right.
showing up for the minyan and making people think that a minyan does not have to be 10.
Right.
That's his
If-
concern. That's his concern.
Rabbi,
Michael, go ahead.
if you say you can go down to 9, what prevents you from in the future going down to 8? Where do you stop?
Okay, that's a slippery slope argument, and some would argue that's a valid argument, and because we have seen that actually we are now down to 0 in person.
Right.
Now, some people would say, okay, we're down to 0 in person, but that's the only, again, notice what's the pragmatic argument? The pragmatic argument is that the only way we can possibly have a minyan, no matter what great program we have, no matter how many phone calls we make, no matter how many pleas and appeals we make to people to physically come to the minyan, at some level, it just don't work. So the argument is, since that doesn't work, that becomes now an emergency situation, which is solved by counting anybody on Zoom for the minyan. Now, you're right. So the question is, to what degree? And let's be honest, there's a very important pragmatic issue here. So part of the issue here is, does the pragmatic issue override what is a clear teaching from the tradition about counting people for a minyan? And a lot of congregations are saying yes. Okay. Now, we're not talking about Zoom minions here. We're just talking about the 10th. So let's go back to that. Okay. What about a community where there are only 9 Jews? And Rabbi Fine points out his father about, the Old West or the wagon train, what has changed in our days? The world is exponentially smaller. Not only are distances less insurmountable, but the technology of communication have brought us together in real ways that our predecessors could not have imagined. Because the Committee of Jewish Laws and Standards has already approved the various options of employing remote technology to form a minyan, so there are people already, the Committee of Jewish Law has already said one possible option is to count people on Zoom, any number of people on Zoom. It seems to me that one is better to rely on those opinions that involve real adult Jews through virtual connections over the use of an inanimate sacred. In other words, better you should count people on a Zoom than you should count the Sefer Torah. And because both the Teshuvot by Rabbi Heller and myself agree, the Fi Kol Hadayot, that means everyone agrees, that one may fulfill the obligations of prayer and saying Kaddish through connecting remotely, as argued in another Teshuvah, there's less reason to employ a leniency to constitute a minyan of less than 10. This is not to say there are not any reasons. It is understandable that a community will want to have its own physical minyan so it can read Torah, partake of the rituals. However, part of the magic and power of ritual, that is its effectiveness, is rooted in the achievement of a quorum, a minyan that is constituted by 10. So what does he conclude? Sucked in. One may not constitute a minyan by 9 and a sacred object, such as a Torah scroll. Okay. Comments, concerns about his conclusions? Yeah, Fran, go ahead.
Okay, well, I think that we're losing track of things here because isn't it better to count a minor as the 10th person? He's a human being and he's Jewish and whatever, than to count an inanimate object as a 10th.
Well, again, you're dealing with a pragmatic issue, and so the question that Rabbi Wise is asked, well, he's asking several questions, but one of the questions is he is saying that even though pragmatically he understands that argument, he feels that it does not override what, in his opinion, is the fact that a minion is 10, 2, that there's the evidence from the texts, right? The evidence from the text is not so strong, is not that strong. Yes, there are some who did it, but that's a minority opinion, and it's a minority opinion that he feels is not accurate, and therefore we should emphasize we should not count the Torah as the 10th. By the way, he's not dealing with the whole question of zooming with, let's face it, he's just talking right now and making a decision on counting a Sefer Torah as number 10. And he says no.
No, right.
Okay. All right. Any others? Jack, did you want to say, can you unmute Jack? Because you're muted. We can't hear you. I know you have had some trouble with unmuting your computer, and I don't know what to tell you. Sometimes if you hold down the space bar, that'll unmute. If you're on a tablet, not a, I'm sorry, we just can't hear you. All right. Any other comments? Yeah, Eddie.
I mean, technically, what's the definition of being at a minion? You can be seen and you can be heard. Is that correct?
Well, you have to be physically present. I mean, I haven't gone into. I mean, if you're hiding in the closet, you're not there.
Right. I mean, you got to be seen and heard, from what I understand.
Yeah, you have to be physically present. Okay.
Over Zoom, you're not really seen nor are you heard, because that's not you. Your voice is digitized and then reconstituted on the other end.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to look at it from a technical aspect, you are not being seen and you are not being heard.
Right. Again, this teshuva is not about that. That question was discussed in a separate teshuva, and there were different opinions about that. There were some opinions that said you could count them as a 10th. Some opinions said that you can't count them at all, and some opinions that said you could count them for all 10. Okay, so there is a difference of opinion. One of those did agree with what you're saying, is that you have to be physically present. This opinion here is, while it did mention those, because those are all other examples of you don't have 10 people physically present, but this decision is very narrow. The Sefer Torah or an ark is not number 10. I mean, at some point we could take a look at those positions about Zoom. Maybe I will do that after. I'll make myself a note if I can find, there it is. We could take a look at that in their opinions.
I mean, it's not possible to be physically to be seen and heard and not be physically present.
Well, sometimes the question is asked, there's a guy in the main sanctuary, but we're in the chapel, he's across the hall and he could yell and we could hear him, but we can't see him, or somebody walking outside by the window. Those questions are asked, but if we're interested, and I'd be happy to take a look at that in the fall, to take a careful look at exactly what it was that the Rabbinical Assembly said was possible, and see the different opinions, because it became very real during, of course, the pandemic.
Right.
Okay.
So, Rabbi,
Yes.
Rabbi, if it's question, I found that very interesting, that question, because I could be in the sanctuary, exactly, and I've been preparing for like the Yom HaShoah program, and they don't have enough minyan in the chapel. They have to pull me to be in there physically. So is that the case with a minyan, or not? Or are you going to?
That is, yeah. Well, yeah. The idea that you're physically in the same place in general. Again, I'm as always, there are some technicalities here and there. which I am not that familiar with off the top of my head. But in general, yes, the idea is that you have to be physically, as Ed has pointed out, in the place where the minyan is taking place and not in another room in the, imagine it's Shabbat morning and everybody, it's after the separate chapel has left. And now we have hundreds of people in the synagogue. So one person goes into the chapel and says, "Oh, I got a minyan in here. I'm one person." And we've got 350 in the rest of the building, right? So
Well, what about like I've been at the cemetery and there's a funeral taking place. I'm going to visit my son. This is off. I'm visiting my parents' graves and I want to say Kaddish or something. It's their yard site. Is the fact that I can see them, but they're not participating, is that kosher?
I would not want to answer that without looking at sources. I believe that is the case. I have been in such situations myself where it is not unusual, especially for unveilings, where you sometimes do have a small crowd and you're in a major cemetery where 6 unveilings and 3 funerals are happening, right? Again, I'm not an expert on that, but we can this is something we can look at in the fall. We can look at it in some degree, some detail. I'm not prepared to right now discuss that, but that's a good question. Let me make
Things like that, I brought that up, very interesting.
yeah, because that's not an unusual situation. Making myself a note. Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, so these are interesting minyan questions, which we'll take a look at.
Rabbi,
Yes, Michael.
well, what's your opinion about using a scooter on Shabbos
Using a scooter on Shabbos
to go to shul?
to go to shul, electric or gas?
No, especially adapted for Shabbos.
Well, they've adopted again. I don't want to go into detail right now, but let's just say that one is what's your opinion of electricity, right? Some people may differ between electricity and internal combustion, electric cars versus gas cars. Some people may distinguish, some people may not distinguish. There are questions of how far you're supposed to travel from your home on Shabbat. And there are those types of questions. I am not an expert. Haven't looked into this, but I would just say, if you think if you don't think electricity is forbidden, right, then there's no reason why. You might. Let's put it this way: you would have to be in the more liberal camp to even discuss this. Now, unless, of course, now in Israel they have tried to make certain types of electrical equipment to be able to be used on Shabbat, and again, I'm not an expert on that. Okay, yeah. I mean, but one might argue that using an electric scooter is quote better than turning on an internal combustion engine, which it has the issue of fire. Okay, all right. So I did choose one other topic for us to look at before the oh, it's right there too. Okay, to go back there. And we discussed part of this when we talked about our about animals and some issues about eating meat. But in Rabbi Barmash's book, oops, and since we have, and I just got to move this up. Let me. I got to do something here. There we go. As we have been using Rabbi Barmash's book, she does have a teshuva in it that she wrote. And she wrote this, now, again, it's important to know, in 2007, this was a teshuva. Now, what is interesting about it is note the breakdown of the voting. Some of the ones we've seen have been unanimous, or slight dissension, or an occasional abstention. But notice, this is 2007, 9 in favor, 5 opposed, 7 abstentions. you can only read that as, gee, she didn't convince everybody. And we're going to ask ourselves, why was that? I mean, Rabbi finds the teshuva we just saw was almost unanimous. There were some abstentions. And when we, actually, I do want to look at something else when we share. Here it is. Now remember, Rabbi Barmash, in addition to the text of her book, there's a separate document which is published on the website of the Jewish Publication Society, which asks questions about this. And to Rabbi Barmash's credit, she asks questions about her own writings. It's not just everybody else who we have questions about, but something that I wrote. So when we look at this teshuva this week and next, about veal calves, how does Rabbi Barmash shape the question? What is implied about whether only the rules of kashrut apply to food? Now, here's an interesting question that we're going to see. Why does Rabbi Barmash start the teshuva with a description of how veal calves are raised? Why should we be concerned about how veal calves are raised versus just be concerned about how they are slaughtered, right? The rules of kashrut, one could argue, are specific about how the slaughtering is done. The shochet, the knife, if there's anything wrong with the lungs of the animal, that's all, the animal's dead. But Rabbi Barmash does something here, a description of how veal calves are raised. By the way, anyone want to answer that? Why do you think she begins that discussion there? Yeah, Rini. You're muted.
Okay. I think it's because because the idea of kosher slaughter is to not be cruel to the animal, to give it a quick and instant death. But if you're cruel to it its whole life, what's the difference how you slaughter it? It's cruelty to animals. That's
going to be one of the key questions here. Is it cruelty to animals to be concerned? And by the way, to what degree, and specifically how we are concerned about how the animal is raised. And by the way, once we raise the question of how the animal is raised is going to determine whether or not we think they're kosher, guess what? We're not just talking about veal.
right. Chickens.
Yeah. Hey, let's not forget cattle. Some of the conditions cattle are raised are not ones that are going to be, minimizing pain, right? Feedlots and the way they're done. So this raises some larger issues, which the tradition generally does not put together. The more traditional sources just seem to be worried about the specifics of slaughtering and blemishes on the lungs and things of that nature. But now we're talking about, and animals were, up until, not that long ago, animals were raised in different ways. Actually, I think this will be, I just found this today, and I think this will be, I have to open up, I'm going to open up a file. I had never seen this, so give me a moment to open up this file. Okay, open. Okay.
Isn't there a pasuk in the Torah which says you shouldn't slaughter an animal in front of your mother?
Yeah, I mean, there are, as we will see in Rabbi Barmash's teshuva, there are a not insignificant number of questions about I'm going to open this one up. I have to tell you, there's nothing like visual aids when you're teaching. So I'm going to go to a nice, cute little visual aid, which I'd never seen before. Here it is. Let's talk chicken. How big are today's chickens? The average weight of a chicken, 56 days old. Some of us remember 1957. The average chicken weighed 905 grams. In 1978, it was 1,808 grams. In 2005, it's 4,202 grams. Wow. Chickens must have decided to eat more. No. What's going on here?
It must be force feeding them or crowding them or giving them some kind of drug to make them fat.
Yeah. Something's going on here.
Antibiotics will do that.
I'm sorry, Eddie?
Antibiotics is what they use.
Antibiotics, raising them under restricted conditions, genetically breeding them so that they have larger breasts, or the parts that are more economically feasible. So something's going on here, right? I have to tell you, until this morning when I saw this, I was not aware of it. But it is kind of dramatic. Visual aids certainly give us a look. You see that, right? Broiler chickens have been selectively bred to grow as fat and as fast as possible on as little food as possible, so that they can be slaughtered around 7 weeks of age. But this is not how God and nature designed chickens. If humans grew as fast as the chickens, a 6.5-pound human baby in 2 months would weigh 660 pounds. In other words, it's a 10 times, skeletal malformations, lesions, heart problems, not a matter of giving them more space. It's too painful for them to walk. So, we have some larger questions, not just about veal, but about animals in general. Eddie, you having a comment?
Yeah, I just want to point out that a 4,200 gram chicken is almost 10 pounds.
Okay.
That has to be for commercial use. I don't think we get those at the food showcase.
Yeah.
Probably not. But my argument would be that there's no questions that the chickens you buy today come from chickens that have been bred and fed and reared in ways that they are much larger than the chickens of, say, 60 years ago. Okay, is that a fair statement, Ed, would you say?
I don't know. I mean, the kosher chickens I look at and we buy are, 3 pounds for the two of us and 5 pounds if we're having somebody over. So that's far smaller than what you just showed.
They're showing, yeah. So in reality, there may be small ones, but clearly rearing chickens has changed. Let's make that clear, right? Rearing chickens has changed. And the questions about rearing animals for food, certainly, what they call factory breeding has changed. And the questions that are raised about that are how we weigh some of these issues, which are tsa'ar ba'alei chayim. Can we be cruel to animals? Which raises the larger question: should we even be eating animals? Right? Should we be wearing leather belts, no matter how the animal died? So there are a lot of questions that are raised. And notice with Rabbi Barmash, notice how she phrases it. She criticizes herself. This is how she phrases the question, starting, considering the conditions in which veal calves are raised. First sentence. In other words, we know where she's going right from the beginning because she asks that question, right? There's the halakhic prohibitions of tsa'ar ba'alei chayim, inflicting suffering on animals, as kariyut, cruelty. We are prohibited from being cruel. We're not only talking about being cruel to animals, but is the being cruel to animals making us cruel, make the raising of veal calves in such a manner and the selling, purchase, or consumption of veal from these animals no longer permissible? Of course, there's an opposite question, which I hope we'll have a chance to take into account. So if they changed the way they had veal animals reared and it was more humane, would that veal be kosher?
Wouldn't be veal.
It wouldn't be veal. It wouldn't, let's put it wouldn't be the type of veal that we are used to, right?
Right.
Okay. It would be different. By the way, we're also talking about slaughtering young animals, right? One of the hallmarks of veal, it's a young animal, right?
Right.
Okay. So is that in and of itself cruel to kill a young animal? And if you fed them differently, which would affect the way the meat looks and probably the way the meat maybe, I'm not clear, we'll see this later, the way the meat tastes. So nowadays, if the veal farmers can say, oh, we don't do this anymore, right? What would you do now? I can't remember the last time I ate veal. I stopped eating veal a long time ago. And the consumption of veal in the United States is about 1/10 of what it was at one point. So that seems to be these questions seem to have implications not just for the kosher consumer, but in many other consumers as well. It's interesting how this issue of tsar balei chayim, which is expressed in the Jewish way, in the general culture,
Rabbi,
been expressed in the way we treat animals. Hey, look at the dog food commercials, right? Okay, you can't miss them, at least on the stations that I watch.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
you know, that we originally were vegetarians. God allowed us to eat meat as a concession, and eventually we'll become vegetarians again.
correct, Michael. That's the classic ideological view that many people take. The Garden of Eden, people don't know, but it was a vegetarian menu. And that in the Messianic days, well, if the lamb is going to lie down with the lion, right, we're not going to be cruel to animals or eat meat. So in this in-between period, we have the concession to eat meat. But again, does that concession imply that it is a higher level of holiness if we refrain from eating meat? Or, and we discussed this a little bit before, aren't there sources that talk about eating meat is the definition of a joyous meal that celebrates a Jewish holy day, right? Typically, what's on the menu of a Shabbat dinner, right? If a Jew is eating a chicken, one of them is sick, right? You know that old joke. But the point is that we associate to this, of course, we associate to this day. Meat in a meal is still is seen as a more joyous, a more special, a more important type of meal. So but notice what she does here. She starts with that. She doesn't say, well, we know that the veal is slaughtered kosher and the kosher rules apply to the veal, but there's where she says, is this tsa'ar balei chayim an important factor in determining what we eat? Okay. Now, by the way, if that is the case, as I said, we might want to ask ourselves about lots of things, lots of meat that we eat. Most of the beef, a lot of the chicken. I mean, they do sell free-range chicken, right? Or, well, they can sell organic beef, but that still doesn't prove to us. The beef may be organic, but we're not 100% sure how they were raised. But there are producers of meat that do say, and there's a kosher farm that has very strict kosher ways of slaughtering the animals, but also advertises themselves as a place in which the animals are treated properly. How much more are you willing to pay for your meat to buy it from a place where they say we are very scrupulous, not only about how the animal is slaughtered, but about Sa'ar Balei Chaim, about how the animal is treated. You willing to pay more? How much? 10 cents a pound? 20 cents a pound? $1 a pound? Is it
It's
economic?
the equivalent of Halav Yisrael.
Well, yes and no. Halav Yisrael, by the way, that means Jewish milk or Jewish dairy products. That is based that has a whole other thing where the idea that Jews are involved in the processing of the milk, right, the whole way along. Because in ancient times, even in medieval times, there was concern that somehow something non-kosher might get mixed in to the processing of the milk from the time it left the cow to the time it got on your table. So now you have Chalav Yisrael, which you can be guaranteed was watched the whole way through, and has become a hallmark of some of the more religious Jews in America. By the way, if they're so scrupulous about Chalav Yisrael, Michael, and you're right, why shouldn't they be scrupulous about Sa'ar Balei Chaim?
And they should be.
Well, that's the question we're going to ask. And we're going to see some rabbis ask that exact question. But what has happened is Chalav Yisrael has become one of the markers. I'm a frum Jew, right? I only have Chalav Yisrael. Is that a product of the increasing right-wing movement among religious Jews? Or is it something that is just something that Jews should do? You know, someone argue this as well, as things have become more and more right-wing, more stringent aspects of Jewish practice have become normative in certain communities, right? I mean, that we see that's Chalav Yisrael, an example of that, because for the vast majority of Jews, and they've asked rabbis and rabbis say, you know, the way milk is produced in the United States today, you have certain federal and state guidelines that you're not going to worry that non-kosher stuff is going to get dropped into your milk. It's not going to happen.
How about shmur matzah?
That's okay. Again, this is an interesting question because I will point out that sometimes you find the same principles on the opposite side, i.e., one could argue that it's sometimes more likely that, quote, liberal Jews would be more concerned about Sa'ar Balei Chaim than some of the more frum Jews, right? I mean, is the idea of kindness to animals becoming more of a factor in certain parts of American life, which includes lots of Jews, but it hasn't penetrated into this question of veal. We're going to, she will take a look at she will take a look, and I also have some texts about that, right? Because that's the exact question. And and as a matter of fact, it's expressed in those exact terms. If those in the very traditional Jewish world are so concerned about so many aspects of Jewish life, which have now become sort of hallmarks of Orthodox Jewish life, which they were not, right? Some of you grew up in Orthodox communities 50 or 60 years. Who ever heard of Chalav Yisrael, right? So that has become the hallmark, but why hasn't Sa'ar Balei Chaim? Or should Sa'ar Balei Chaim? Okay, all right. Wait just a couple of minutes. So let's just see how she lays this out. And I admit it's a rather lengthy teshuva. I hope I'll try to. I want to try. It would be nice to us to finish this semester, shall we say, by finishing this. Okay, so hopefully by this week and next week we'll get through this, which means we're gonna have to skip over a little bit of it. Okay, so that's the question. Now here's the teshuva. She points out 25 years ago, community Jewish law approved the teshuva prohibiting the use of shackling and hoisting, i.e., to slaughter a kosher cow, let's say, they put a chain around its back leg, lifted it off the floor, hanging from its back leg. So now the neck is fully exposed, which gives the shochet a very easy way of seeing and severing the arteries and the windpipe in one easy, fast, cut. I saw this happening. I think I mentioned when I was in rabbinical school, us rabbinical students went out to a kosher slaughtering house and we watched this. because that's the way they did it in 1972, I guess it was, or something like that. No, actually, no, it was, yeah, about 1972. I'm not sure the exact date. So the committee said no, and in fact that has had an effect, so that in the world of kosher slaughtering, they pretty much don't do that anymore. That has changed. Okay, but what about veal calves? Intensive confinement, all milk diet, because the iron changes the color of the meat. Other problematic, and saying that there's a plight of the veal. So what are her considerations? You know, God is portrayed in the Bible as being concerned with the welfare of animals, and there are lots of examples. You know, if you see the donkey of your enemy lying under its burden, you must arrange to lift it with him. If you see a donkey or ox fallen, do not ignore it. You must help to raise them. And she gives all of these examples. And the one we also saw, which was an interesting one because there are some different interpretations of this. If you happen upon a bird's nest and you see the mother and the eggs, do not take the mother together with her young, or the mother and the fledglings. You must let the mother go and take only the young, so that you may fare well and have a long life. Why do you set the mother away? Well, again, there's a difference of opinion in the sources. Some say you send the mother away because you don't want you don't want to be cruel to the animal and see the mother and have the mother watch her youngsters taken away. Although there's another opinion, no, you're not concerned about the mother. It's a cruel thing to do, and it makes you, a human being, cruel to do something like that. So there's a debate as to whether it's because you're worried about the feelings of the mother or the feelings of the person. Do not plow with an ox and a donkey together. Do not muzzle an ox while threshing. You know, right. Here's the paradox. Human beings are permitted to use animals, must use them. They must treat them with compassion. Again, we're talking about a society, a pre-industrial age society. How did most heavy work get done? With animals, right? They didn't just ride horses. They plowed. They carried heavy burdens. They pulled carts. All the type of heavy work that we no longer need animals to do were done with animals. Okay, and animals were an essential part of sacrificial worship. Human beings were allowed to consume animals under certain restrictions, required to partake of them. In other words, not only was it allowed, but if you were bringing your sacrifices to the temple, human beings were going to eat the animal's meat after it was slaughtered. Human beings were given the license to utilize animals, but at the same time commanded to treat them with compassion. God, too, is portrayed as having compassion for animals. So here again, there's how do we weigh this? How do we weigh this? So she goes into oh, by the way, just as an aside, I found this interesting. Meat was not part of the daily diet of the average Israelite. In ancient times, it was eaten as part of a special meal or for entertaining guests, celebrating festivals. In other words, unlike today, how many of us Americans eat meat multiple times during the week? Right? Most Americans consume meat multiple times during the week, not even the main meal, right? They consume it at lunch or even at breakfast, right? So the question is, how often did they, in ancient times, meat was really special, right? You couldn't just go to the store and pick up something. You had to slaughter an animal, and you didn't have refrigeration. Okay.
In fact, Rabbi, on Shavuos, tradition says we should eat dairy, not meat.
It's true, but again, is the question we're eating dairy because we don't want to be cruel, or there are other interpretations that, well, on Shavuot, the Torah was given, and people didn't have time to prepare kosher meals and slaughter the animals and drain the blood and do everything else. So let's make it easy. We want to eat a meal. We're having a holiday. Let's just do it dairy, right? So there are different interpretations about that. But you're right. Shavuot is a time where dairy is consumed. Okay, it is forbidden to purchase a domestic or wild animal or bird if one does not have the means to feed it. Of course, again, think of how society has changed. Again, any of you dog or cat owners here? I know some of you may be. Have you noticed the market for nutritious food for dogs and cats, the concern for the welfare of the pet has increased in American life, right? So that's just another larger societal trend, right? So if one caused suffering, this is from Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, putting too heavy a burden, beating it, be liable because the animal suffers. So I love this next part. Likewise, those who pull the ears of cats to make them scream are sinners. You got that? Any cat owners here? But notice he specifies this, that okay, you can have pets, you can play with them, but don't do anything to make them do to hurt them, right? Okay. Okay. We're gonna just one more, the necessity to have good food requires us the animals be killed. The aim was to kill them in the easiest manner. That we see in kashrut. Okay, so we'll pick this up next time. Comments or questions before we end this week? Okay, good to see you all. Have a lovely day, and we'll pick this up and finish. Well, we're going to finish it next week. All right.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you all.